A black woman sat alone in the waiting room of a prestigious hospital, clutching her chest and trying to steady her breathing. The room was quiet, its pristine walls and cold air somehow adding weight to her pain. She tried to catch the eye of the nurse behind the counter, hoping for help, for compassion. But the nurse barely glanced up. When she did, her face held a look that spoke volumes, an unspoken judgment. "Please," the woman murmured, her voice wavering. I need help. I think, something's really wrong." The nurse rolled her eyes, her voice dripping with indifference. "You need to wait. There are protocols here," she said, her tone icy. "We don't just jump to assist everyone who walks in. Especially not people who look like." She let the sentence trail off, but the implication hung heavy in the air. The woman's face flushed, not just from her own fear but from the humiliating realization of what she was up against. In this state, in this place that was supposed to offer care and compassion, she was being judged, not as a patient but as something less, something unworthy. Each word from the nurse felt like another blow. The woman looked around the waiting room, desperate for some sign of empathy or help, but the few other people in the room quickly looked away, avoiding her eyes. She gripped the edge of the counter with trembling hands, trying to stay on her feet. "I'm begging you," she whispered, her voice breaking, vulnerability and fear seeping into her words. "Please, can't you see I'm in pain?" But the nurse's expression didn't change. She merely crossed her arms, her gaze hardening. "Ma'am, maybe you need to calm down. This isn't a free clinic," she snapped, her voice full of thinly veiled disdain. "People don't just walk in here demanding treatment." The woman's chest tightened even more, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. She felt the walls closing in, the sense of helplessness crushing her. And in that moment, she wondered, was her life worth less to this woman simply because of the color of her skin? The nurse turned back to her computer, as if the woman's suffering was nothing more than an inconvenience, barely worth acknowledging. Seconds dragged by, each one filled with a growing sense of betrayal, a feeling that she, as a person, was invisible, less than human in the eyes of this supposed caregiver. The woman's vision blurred, and she staggered, her hand reaching out in one last plea. But the nurse leaned away, recoiling as though touched by something dirty. "Do not touch me," the nurse hissed, casting a disgusted look at the woman's hand. "Honestly, I don't understand why people think they can just walk in here like this." Just then, footsteps echoed down the hallway, brisk and purposeful. A man appeared in the doorway, his face hardening at the sight before him. He'd come expecting a warm reunion, a check on the patients he held dear, and instead, he was met with this scene: his wife, the woman he loved, looking barely able to stand, pleading for help from a nurse who wore her contempt on her sleeve. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his tone controlled but deadly serious. The nurse turned, her expression shifting to a look of surprise, perhaps even a flicker of fear. I was just explaining that we have protocols," she stammered, her tone different now, touched with a hint of panic. "Protocols," he repeated, his gaze shifting from the nurse to his wife, noting the pain etched on her face. "Is that what this is about? Protocols?" His words came out quietly, yet they held a weight that made the nurse step back, her confidence faltering. The room was thick with silence. The other patients sat frozen, watching the scene unfold, sensing the gravity of the moment. The nurse looked around, realizing that the tables had turned. Her authority, her air of superiority, had vanished in an instant. And just like that, the woman wasn't the one feeling small anymore. "What do you have to say for yourself?" the man asked, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of anger that sent chills through everyone present. He was no ordinary visitor, there was a power behind his words, a weight that demanded respect. But the nurse hesitated, searching for words, her arrogance dissolving as quickly as it had come. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, their judgment now focused squarely on her. You're the owner," she finally whispered, a trace of panic creeping into her voice. He didn't answer, didn't need to. The look in his eyes said everything. The silent fury, the indignation of seeing his wife treated as if her life were worthless. His stare bore into her, exposing her prejudice for all to see. The nurse's face flushed, the smugness replaced by an unmistakable fear as she realized the weight of her mistake. But the room wasn't done watching. The other patients, the onlookers, their expressions slowly shifted, from curiosity, to shock, to something darker, something that mirrored the very judgment she had inflicted on another. And in that charged silence, one question hung in the air, unspoken but clear as day: what will he do now? The answer to that question, the true weight of that justice, was something no one in that room, least of all the nurse, was prepared to face. But whatever it was, it would be unforgettable. Just how far would he go to make things right? Hello, and welcome to Plough of Twist. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to say that this channel stands firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. We believe in equality, respect, and understanding for everyone, regardless of background or appearance. Stories like the one you're about to hear are crafted to shed light on injustice and the importance of standing up for what's right. We hope this narrative inspires and resonates with you. If you enjoy it, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that make a difference. Enjoy the story. The hospital was a place of quiet precision, a space where lives intersected in urgent whispers and where the lines of power and privilege often went unspoken but strongly felt. Set on the upper side of the city, Oakwood Medical Center was known for its spotless halls, high-caliber specialists, and reputation for catering to the elite. Its pristine white walls and sharp sense of antiseptic were both comforting and intimidating, a place where only those who could afford it sought care. This was a space for the well-heeled, the influential, a sanctuary of medical excellence cloaked in the austere elegance of glass and polished metal. In the administrative wing, Darnell Whitmore was a familiar face. Tall, composed, with an air of quiet authority, Darnell wasn't just another man in a suit, he was the owner and chief administrator of Oakwood Medical Center. Darnell carried himself with the calm assurance of a man who had built his life on discipline, resilience, and dedication. Born in a humble neighborhood, he had fought tooth and nail to climb every rung on his way to success, earning degrees, accolades, and respect, eventually acquiring Oakwood, the very hospital where he had once been turned away as a boy for not having the right insurance. Darnell's deep commitment to the hospital extended beyond ownership. He saw it as a personal mission to ensure that Oakwood not only upheld a high standard of care but also served as a place of dignity and respect for all who entered. Married to LaTanya, a kind-hearted and strong-willed woman who had supported him from his earliest days, Darnell often credited much of his success to her unwavering belief in him. LaTanya was his grounding force, a woman who radiated warmth and sincerity. She, too, had come from a humble background, and her experiences had given her a profound empathy for others. Together, they shared a belief in justice, compassion, and the hard-earned truth that people deserve to be treated with dignity, regardless of where they came from. LaTanya's relationship with the hospital was different from Darnell's. Where he held the title and authority, she preferred to keep a low profile, visiting him at Oakwood occasionally, checking in on patients with the kind of attentiveness that made people feel seen and valued. Her presence was like a quiet light, unassuming yet deeply impactful. While she didn't work directly at Oakwood, she was known by many, often mistaken for a social worker or counselor because of her gentle yet assertive way of connecting with patients. But not everyone at Oakwood saw LaTanya or people like her through the same lens of respect and empathy. Among the nurses, there was one in particular who held views that stood in stark contrast to the values that Darnell and LaTanya cherished. Stephanie Reynolds, a veteran nurse with decades in the field, prided herself on her experience and authority within the hospital. To most people, Stephanie seemed like a competent, no-nonsense professional, someone who had seen it all and could handle emergencies with a calm hand. However, there was a side to her that few dared to confront directly. Stephanie had grown up in a different world from Darnell and LaTanya. Raised in a family that believed in social hierarchies and clung to rigid beliefs about class and race, her views had quietly infiltrated her professional life over the years. To her, Oakwood was a fortress of exclusivity, a place where only the right kind of people belonged. Her voice carried a tone of superiority, and her eyes often held a cold gaze that many patients, particularly those who didn't fit in, found unsettling. In her mind, Stephanie justified her behavior as a matter of upholding standards. She told herself she was simply enforcing order, that people needed to know their place in an institution as prestigious as Oakwood. The truth, however, was that her sense of superiority often veered into discrimination. She didn't always voice her biases openly, but she rarely made an effort to hide them either, choosing instead to mask her prejudices with bureaucratic language about protocols and procedure. It was in this simmering atmosphere of unspoken power dynamics that an ordinary day would take a dramatic turn, shifting the lives of everyone involved. LaTanya arrived at Oakwood that afternoon feeling slightly unwell. She had woken up with a tightness in her chest that she brushed off as stress or perhaps a minor cold. But as the day progressed, the discomfort grew sharper, settling like a weight over her heart. Still, she hadn't wanted to bother Darnell with her concerns, knowing how busy he was with back-to-back meetings. She decided to stop by the hospital on her own, thinking she could quickly check in with one of the doctors she knew. As she walked into the lobby, a wave of dizziness hit her, and she had to steady herself against a chair. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled her nostrils as she took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She scanned the room and spotted Stephanie behind the reception desk, typing briskly on her computer. Approaching the counter, LaTanya offered a faint smile, hoping that Stephanie would recognize her, but Stephanie's eyes barely lifted from her screen. LaTanya cleared her throat, her voice gentle but laced with the urgency she felt. "Excuse me, I'm not feeling well. I think I might need some assistance," she said softly, hoping her words would convey the severity of her condition. Stephanie looked up, her gaze cold and assessing. Her expression hardened as she took in LaTanya's appearance, a faint curl of disdain twisting her lips. Without offering so much as a polite greeting, she responded in a clipped tone, "And do you have an appointment?" LaTanya's breath was coming faster now, each inhale feeling like a battle against the tightness in her chest. No, I didn't make an appointment. But I really don't feel well. Could you please call someone?" Stephanie's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing as she sized LaTanya up. There was a flicker of annoyance in her gaze, as if LaTanya's presence was somehow an intrusion. "This is a hospital, not a walk-in clinic," she said, her voice icy. "If you need assistance, you'll have to follow the proper protocols." LaTanya's heart pounded faster, frustration and disbelief mingling with her rising sense of panic. She felt the strength leaving her legs, and she gripped the counter for support. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I really don't feel well. I think it's serious." Stephanie leaned back, crossing her arms in a gesture that radiated indifference. "Ma'am, we don't just drop everything because someone walks in feeling a little under the weather. There are other patients here with real needs." The words stung, each one hitting LaTanya like a slap. She opened her mouth to protest, to plead, but the pain in her chest was growing worse, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. She tried to steady herself, to find the strength to argue, but the look in Stephanie's eyes told her it was pointless. In that moment, LaTanya felt as though she were fading, becoming invisible under the cold, dismissive stare of the nurse. It was as if her suffering, her humanity, was being stripped away, reduced to nothing more than an inconvenience in the mind of the woman who was supposed to help her. But what neither of them knew was that, just down the hall, Darnell was wrapping up a meeting. He had finished earlier than expected and decided to take a moment to check in on his wife. He had no idea of the situation unfolding in the lobby, no inkling of the pain and humiliation LaTanya was enduring just steps away. As LaTanya struggled to stay upright, she heard a voice behind her, familiar, steady, and filled with concern. "Latanya? Are you all right?" Turning slowly, her vision blurred by tears and the haze of her pain, she saw Darnell standing there, his expression shifting from surprise to alarm as he took in her condition. He reached out, steadying her, his face a mask of worry. Darnell's gaze then shifted to Stephanie, and in that instant, a chilling silence fell over the room. The nurse, who had held herself with such confidence and superiority, now found herself under the scrutiny of the one person who could bring consequences she hadn't foreseen. And in that silence, each heartbeat, each shared glance between Darnell and Stephanie, held a gravity that hinted at the justice to come. The silence in the lobby hung thick, like a storm waiting to break. Darnell's grip on Latanya tightened as he guided her gently to a nearby chair, his gaze shifting from her pained expression to Stephanie's blank stare. His wife's face was pale, her breathing labored, and every instinct in him screamed that something was very wrong. The situation was so surreal, he barely had time to process the emotions coursing through him. He didn't need to understand every detail to know that something deeply wrong had just unfolded in his hospital. Turning his attention to Stephanie, he kept his voice calm but unyielding. "Did you even listen to her?" he asked, each word laced with barely contained anger. Stephanie straightened, her initial look of shock replaced by a flicker of defiance as she struggled to regain her composure. "Sir, I was following protocol," she replied, her tone as rigid as her stance. "This is a hospital, and we have certain procedures for patients who arrive without appointments." "Procedures?" Darnell's voice was deceptively soft, but his eyes were cold. "Are you telling me that those procedures involve refusing to help a patient who's in obvious pain?" Stephanie swallowed, her hands clasping tightly together as if to bolster herself. "We're a high-volume facility, sir. People come in expecting immediate treatment all the time, and we simply can't accommodate everyone. I was doing my job." Darnell held her gaze, the intensity of his scrutiny unyielding. "And in the process of doing your job, you looked at my wife, who could barely stand, and dismissed her. Tell me, how does that align with the values of this hospital? The values I personally have reinforced since the day I took ownership." Latanya reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it gently on Darnell's arm. "Please," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with dignity. Don't make a scene on my account." But Darnell shook his head. "No, Latanya. This is about more than just today. This is about how you, and others like you, are treated the moment someone like Stephanie decides they don't fit in." The tension was palpable, and the staff nearby exchanged nervous glances, unsure of whether to intervene or retreat. Stephanie's face flushed as the weight of Darnell's words settled over her. Her eyes darted around the room, seeking some sort of escape or perhaps a word of support from her colleagues, but the bystanders were just as shocked as Darnell himself. "I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding," Stephanie finally stammered, her voice cracking. She forced a brittle smile that did little to mask her unease. "Perhaps I was too firm. But in my experience, we get many people who exaggerate their symptoms." "Exaggerate?" Darnell's voice grew sharper, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Are you suggesting my wife was faking her symptoms?" Stephanie's forced smile faded as she realized her mistake, but it was too late to backpedal. I didn't mean it like that. I only meant that, there are people who take advantage." Darnell's gaze never wavered, and each word he spoke was laced with an authority that silenced the entire room. "You know, Stephanie, I've worked my entire life to make this hospital a place of respect and healing. A place where every single person, regardless of their background, is treated with dignity. And yet, here we are, discussing how a trained nurse, a nurse who's worked here for years, decided it was appropriate to dismiss someone in distress. Someone you knew was my wife." Stephanie's expression twisted with something that looked like fear. She knew Darnell's reputation, knew he was a man who didn't tolerate injustice. Yet she clung to her last shred of defiance. "With all due respect, sir," she said, attempting to sound composed, "I don't treat anyone differently. I was only following the rules as I understand them. Darnell's eyes narrowed. As you understand them? So you're saying that turning away a woman who could barely stand is part of those rules? LaTonya, watching the exchange, gently touched Darnell's arm again, silently pleading with him. She knew he felt a deep sense of betrayal and disappointment, not just for her but for everything he had tried to create at Oakwood. Darnell, please, don't let this escalate, she whispered, her voice filled with quiet resilience. But her words only deepened the furrow in Darnell's brow. He looked down at her, his eyes softening, but the storm of emotions was still evident in his stance. LaTonya, you shouldn't have to ask me to stop. You should never have been put in this position in the first place. Turning back to Stephanie, Darnell's voice became colder, his resolve solidified. I'd like you to step aside, Stephanie. We're going to make sure LaTonya receives the care she deserves. A flicker of panic crossed Stephanie's face, but she nodded and moved aside. As another nurse stepped forward, offering LaTonya a comforting smile and guiding her toward an examination room, Stephanie stood rooted in place, her face a mixture of anger and dread. She had never been openly confronted like this, had never imagined that her actions would come under scrutiny so sharply and so publicly. Yet, as Darnell watched his wife disappear down the hallway with the new nurse, his anger was far from dissipated. He turned back to Stephanie, his gaze unwavering. We'll speak again soon, he said, his tone carrying an ominous weight that left her visibly unsettled. The hours that followed were tense. Darnell stayed by LaTonya's side as the doctors conducted their exams, each finding confirming that her symptoms were serious and had required immediate attention. His heart twisted with a mix of relief and fury. Relief that she was finally receiving the care she needed, and fury at the thought of what could have happened if he hadn't arrived when he did. He spent the evening pacing the hallways, his mind replaying every second of that encounter with Stephanie. The look on LaTonya's face, the cold dismissal in Stephanie's tone, it all replayed in his mind, fanning the flames of his frustration. As night fell, he knew that this wasn't something he could simply let go. This wasn't just about a single moment, it was about the deeper, more insidious biases that had been allowed to flourish within Oakwood. The next morning, Darnell made a call to the hospital board, arranging a meeting for later that week. His decision was firm, there would be accountability, and Stephanie would have to answer for her actions. But as the hours passed, Darnell's resolve was tested by the memories of years spent trying to build this institution into a beacon of hope and care. He was no stranger to the challenges that came with addressing biases and prejudices, but this time, it felt personal. On the day of the board meeting, Stephanie sat at the end of the long conference table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, her usual confidence replaced by a look of apprehension. The board members filed in, their faces unreadable, and Darnell took his seat at the head of the table, his expression as steely as ever. Thank you all for coming, he began, his tone formal and composed. We're here today to discuss an incident that occurred 2 days ago. An incident that reflects not only on the individuals involved but also on the values that we, as a hospital, claim to uphold. Stephanie shifted uncomfortably in her chair, glancing around the room as if hoping for some form of support. But the board members remained silent, their gazes fixed on Darnell. Stephanie, he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly as he addressed her directly, I want you to explain, in your own words, why you felt it was appropriate to deny assistance to a patient in distress. Stephanie's voice was barely above a whisper. I was following the protocols, sir. I thought I was doing what was best for the hospital. What was best for the hospital? Darnell's voice grew colder, each word enunciated with precision. And how, exactly, is it best for the hospital to turn away someone in need, especially when that person's life might be at risk? Stephanie hesitated, her hands wringing together. Sir, I thought she wasn't really that sick. She didn't have an appointment, and, well, we have a lot of people who come in without appointments expecting immediate attention. Darnell's expression didn't change. So you assumed she was exaggerating. You assumed her symptoms weren't serious, despite her telling you otherwise? Stephanie nodded, but her face twisted in frustration, as if struggling to justify her actions even to herself. I've seen it before, sir. People come in, making a scene, and then they turn out to be fine. Making a scene? Darnell repeated, his voice now almost dangerously quiet. My wife wasn't making a scene, Stephanie. She was experiencing symptoms that required immediate attention. And because you decided, on nothing more than an assumption, that she wasn't worth your time, you put her life in danger. A tense silence fell over the room, each board member shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Stephanie's face turned a shade paler, and her composure cracked, revealing a flicker of remorse mixed with resentment. She opened her mouth to respond, but Darnell's gaze was unwavering, holding her silent. I've spent years building this hospital, Stephanie, he continued, his voice filled with a quiet yet powerful intensity. Years fighting to make it a place where everyone, regardless of who they are, feels safe, respected, and valued. What you did, it goes against everything I believe in. And it goes against everything this hospital stands for. Stephanie's eyes dropped to the table, and a bitter silence filled the room as Darnell's words resonated. Each board member exchanged a look, the gravity of the situation evident on their faces. But what none of them knew was that Darnell's plan for justice was only just beginning. The silence that lingered now was a precursor to something far deeper, something that would shake the foundations of Oakwood Medical Center and expose the buried prejudices that had been allowed to thrive. And as Stephanie sat there, unable to meet Darnell's gaze, the tension in the room hinted at a reckoning far more profound than anyone could have anticipated. The boardroom was silent, the air heavy with anticipation as every eye remained fixed on Darnell. He took a deep breath, letting the gravity of the moment settle around him, each second marked by the tension etched across the room. Stephanie sat directly across from him, her posture stiff, her gaze shifting between the other board members, her discomfort evident. Yet she clung to an air of composure, a veneer of professionalism she clearly hoped would shield her. Clearing his throat, Darnell began, his tone calm but cutting. I didn't call this meeting just to review hospital policy, nor to discuss how procedures can be improved. No. This meeting is about accountability. The word hung in the air, resonating like a gavel hitting the block. Stephanie's face tensed, her expression betraying a hint of the panic she struggled to contain. Stephanie, Darnell continued, his gaze pinning her in place, you were entrusted with the health, the well-being, and the dignity of every patient who walks through these doors. Your role isn't just clinical, it's human. When you dismissed my wife, you showed a disregard not only for her as a patient but for the very standards this hospital upholds. Stephanie swallowed, finally meeting Darnell's gaze. Her voice, usually assertive, now quivered slightly. Sir, with all respect, I was following the protocols. Protocol? Darnell interrupted, his voice slicing through her excuse. Protocol doesn't absolve anyone from the responsibility of basic human decency. There was a murmur among the board members, subtle nods of agreement as Darnell's words hit their mark. Stephanie's face flushed, her attempt at maintaining composure visibly faltering. Darnell continued, his tone steady but with a palpable edge of controlled anger. Oakwood was founded to be more than just a high-end facility. It was meant to be a haven of care, compassion, and professionalism, a place where patients are seen as people first. What you showed to my wife was the opposite of that. You stripped her of her dignity the moment you looked at her and decided she was less deserving of care. Stephanie's hands twisted together, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't personal, sir. I didn't mean. I didn't know it was your wife. Darnell's expression hardened, his gaze piercing. And if she hadn't been my wife, would that have justified your treatment of her? Stephanie's mouth opened, then closed, the implication of his words settling like a weight on her shoulders. She shifted uncomfortably, the gravity of her actions dawning on her as Darnell's words resonated in the room. Another board member cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Stephanie, it's clear that there was a severe lapse in judgment on your part. This isn't about protocol, but about a fundamental issue with how you approached the situation. You ignored a patient in distress. Whether she was the owner's wife or a stranger off the street, your actions were inexcusable. Stephanie's face flushed a deeper red, and she glanced around the table, her desperation mounting. I understand that mistakes were made, she replied, her voice tense. But to be clear, I had no way of knowing how serious her condition was. People often exaggerate symptoms, and we can't. Darnell raised his hand, silencing her. What you're saying, Stephanie, is that you let your assumptions guide your decision. You assumed, based on whatever criteria you saw fit, that her symptoms weren't severe enough to warrant immediate attention. You judged her, not by her medical needs, but by your own biases. Stephanie's gaze dropped to the table, her hands wringing together as her defenses crumbled. The silence in the room felt like an indictment, every face turned toward her with expressions that ranged from disappointment to outright disapproval. After a long pause, Darnell spoke again, this time with a measured calm that felt like a final judgment. There will be consequences, Stephanie. Not only because of the harm you nearly caused but because this is not the first time we've received complaints about your treatment of certain patients. Your actions have tarnished the reputation of this hospital and undermined everything it stands for. Stephanie's face turned ghostly pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she looked up at him, her expression one of horror. Wait, complaints? Her voice wavered, the edges fraying with panic. No one's ever mentioned anything to me before. Darnell's gaze was unwavering, his calm almost unnerving. We've received reports from patients, Stephanie. People who felt dismissed, undervalued, ignored. We hoped it was a misunderstanding. But after what happened with LaTanya, it's clear this is more than that. This is a pattern. Stephanie's shoulders slumped, her hands falling to her lap. The weight of his words crushed her defenses, her last shreds of pride unraveling as the reality of her actions set in. Darnell continued, his tone cold. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full review of your conduct. Your actions will be investigated by the board, and if we find that this behavior is, indeed, a pattern as we suspect, there will be no place for you at Oakwood. Stephanie's face twisted in shock, and she stammered, but I've been here for years. I've dedicated my life to this hospital, and in those years, Darnell interrupted, you've treated patients as if they were beneath you. That stops now. The finality of his words struck the room silent once more. The board members exchanged glances, each of them visibly affected by the outcome. It was clear that this was not just about a single incident but a reckoning, a moment of clarity where the hospital's values and the actions of its staff collided in a way that could not be ignored. Stephanie's hands shook as she gathered her things, her face a mask of disbelief and resentment. She glanced around the room, her gaze lingering on each board member as if searching for some last shred of sympathy, but there was none to be found. As she rose to leave, Darnell's voice cut through the silence once more. Stephanie, he said, his tone softer but firm. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's that people's lives are not yours to judge. Every patient who comes through these doors deserves respect. And I expect nothing less from anyone who works here. Her face crumpled, the weight of his words settling like a stone in her chest. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, the sound of the door closing echoing through the silence. The board members sat quietly, each of them grappling with the magnitude of what had just unfolded. Darnell remained seated, his expression thoughtful, a hint of sadness touching his face as he processed the events. His heart was heavy, not with regret but with the understanding that this was a necessary, if painful, step in restoring the integrity of Oakwood. As the meeting concluded, Darnell lingered, alone in the empty boardroom, a sense of calm washing over him. The reckoning had come, and while it had left scars, it was also a moment of justice, a testament to the values he had fought to instill in Oakwood. Outside the door, he found LaTanya waiting, her eyes warm and understanding as she reached out, taking his hand. They exchanged a look, no words needed between them. They had faced the storm together, and in the quiet aftermath, they found strength in each other. For the first time in days, Darnell felt a sense of peace, knowing that Oakwood was once again a place where compassion and respect could flourish, where every person would be seen as they truly were, worthy. As the door to the boardroom closed behind Stephanie, the silence left in her wake was filled with a potent mix of relief and exhaustion. Darnell leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. The board members slowly began to file out, each offering Darnell a solemn nod as they passed. He knew they supported his decision, but he also understood the weight it placed on all of them. It was an unsettling moment for Oakwood, a hard look at the prejudice that had taken root where compassion was supposed to flourish. Once the boardroom was empty, LaTonya appeared in the doorway, her presence grounding and calming as always. Darnell felt the tension release as she stepped toward him, her expression soft yet searching. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly, reaching out to touch his arm. Darnell sighed, his gaze falling to the table as he considered the emotional toll of what had just happened. "It's hard to feel all right after all that. I thought I knew everyone who worked here, thought I'd created a culture of respect, but seeing what Stephanie did, realizing how blind I'd been to it," LaTonya's hand covered his, her warmth comforting. "Darnell, you can't control how people choose to act. What matters is how you handle it when you find out." He looked at her, the gratitude in his eyes mingling with the remnants of the anger he'd held for so long. "When I saw her treating you like that, dismissing you as if you didn't matter, I couldn't believe it. I thought I knew her, thought she understood what Oakwood stands for. But it was like seeing a stranger." LaTonya nodded, a flicker of sadness in her gaze. "Sometimes, it takes something personal to reveal the truth, Darnell. It's painful, but you've done the right thing. You stood up for what matters." She hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And for me." Darnell met her gaze, a bittersweet smile touching his lips. "Always, LaTonya. For you, and for every single patient who walks through those doors." He paused, then continued, his voice firm. "Stephanie thought she could decide who's worth caring for. But that's not her choice to make. No one has that right." The room fell silent, and in that moment, Darnell felt a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to ensuring that Oakwood would stand as a beacon of fairness and integrity, no matter how many difficult conversations lay ahead. But the emotional weight of it was undeniable, the realization that some battles were closer to home than he had ever expected. Just then, a soft knock sounded at the door, and one of the hospital's senior doctors, Dr. Hayden, entered, his expression respectful but tinged with curiosity. "Darnell, I hope I'm not intruding. I just wanted to say that what you did in there, it took courage. A lot of us feel the same way you do. We've seen Stephanie's behavior before, but," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I don't think anyone thought anything would come of it." Darnell's brows knitted, a trace of disappointment flickering in his gaze. "And why didn't anyone say anything, Dr. Hayden?" Dr. Hayden looked down, shifting uncomfortably. "To be honest, I think a lot of us didn't know if we'd be listened to. People who work in high-stakes roles like Stephanie, well, it's not easy to challenge them, especially if you don't think anyone will listen. But seeing you address it, seeing the board take it seriously, it means something." Darnell took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "That's something I'll have to live with, knowing I could have done more to make people feel safe to speak up." His voice softened, a note of resolve strengthening it. "But it won't be like that anymore. I don't want anyone at Oakwood to feel they have to stay silent. We're here to help people, and that includes our staff. If there's a problem, I want to know about it. And I want everyone to know they'll be heard." Dr. Hayden's expression softened, relief and respect evident in his eyes. "Thank you, Darnell. I think a lot of us needed to hear that." He glanced toward LaTonya, offering her a gentle nod. "And Mrs. Whitmore, I hope you're feeling better. What you went through, no one should have to endure that. LaTanya managed a faint smile, her voice steady but kind. Thank you, Dr. Hayden. I'm grateful to have people here who truly care. After Dr. Hayden excused himself, Darnell and LaTanya lingered in the boardroom, absorbing the quiet victory, yet both aware that the true work lay ahead. The damage had been done, but the foundation of trust, though cracked, was not beyond repair. Darnell turned to LaTanya, his expression softening. You've always been my biggest supporter, and I can't thank you enough for being here through this. LaTanya's eyes sparkled, a quiet strength behind them. Darnell, what you've built here, it's more than a hospital. It's a place where people should feel safe, valued. And if today taught us anything, it's that you're willing to fight to make sure it stays that way. Darnell took her hand, holding it tightly as he let her words sink in. You're right. This place is bigger than any one of us. And it's worth every fight to make sure it's everything we believe in. The two of them shared a quiet moment, the weight of the past few days pressing down on them, but also filling them with a newfound determination. Darnell knew there would be more challenges, that he'd have to work harder to create an environment where prejudice had no place. But for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that he was on the right path, guided by the principles that had led him here in the first place. Later that evening, as they prepared to leave, Darnell paused in the hallway, turning to LaTanya. There's one more thing I need to do. She looked at him, curiosity in her gaze. What's that? I want to make sure every employee knows where I stand on this, he said, his voice filled with resolve. No more unspoken rules, no more looking the other way. Everyone needs to know that this is a place where respect is not negotiable. LaTanya smiled, admiration shining in her eyes. Then let's make sure they hear it from you. The next morning, Darnell called an all-staff meeting, a rare occurrence that quickly filled the main auditorium with employees, each wondering what would be addressed. He stood at the front of the room, a spotlight illuminating him as he prepared to speak. Looking out at the room filled with nurses, doctors, administrative staff, and support personnel, Darnell took a deep breath, his voice carrying with strength and sincerity. Thank you all for being here, he began, his gaze sweeping across the faces in the audience. I've called this meeting because I want to address something very close to my heart. This hospital, Oakwood, is a place that's meant to stand for care, compassion, and respect. A place where every single person, regardless of their background, receives the dignity they deserve. The room was silent, every person hanging on his words as he continued. Recently, an incident occurred that made me realize how far we still have to go. An incident that reminded me that biases and prejudices, even if unspoken, have no place in our mission. And that starts with every one of us. He paused, letting his words settle, watching as employees nodded in agreement, some of their faces reflecting the weight of his message. I want you all to know, he said, his tone resolute, that if any of you ever feel disrespected, dismissed, or undervalued here, my door is always open. There is no room for discrimination of any kind at Oakwood. I will not stand for it. And if anyone here feels they cannot commit to that same standard, then this is not the place for them. A murmur rippled through the crowd, expressions of relief, gratitude, and respect crossing the faces of those listening. And as a part of this commitment, Darnell continued, we'll be implementing new training, ongoing discussions, and an open forum for concerns. I want Oakwood to be a place we can all be proud of, a place where no one ever feels invisible or unworthy of care. LaTanya stood off to the side, watching her husband with pride as he spoke. She could see the effect his words were having on those gathered, the sense of unity and purpose building within the room. He was not just a man in charge, he was a leader, someone who understood the responsibility that came with his role. When Darnell finished speaking, the room broke into applause, and he felt a surge of gratitude for the people who made Oakwood what it was. As the applause quieted, a nurse in the front row raised her hand. Mr. Whitmore, she began, her voice filled with respect. I just want to say thank you. Thank you for making this a place where we feel seen and heard. It means a lot to know that we work for someone who cares about what's right. Darnell nodded, a genuine smile spreading across his face. Thank you. And know that I'm committed to this every step of the way. Oakwood is only as strong as the people who believe in it, and I'm grateful to every single one of you. As the meeting adjourned, Darnell and LaTanya lingered in the auditorium, watching as employees filed out, many of them offering words of thanks and encouragement. In that moment, they knew that while the path ahead might be challenging, they had taken a meaningful step toward the future they wanted for Oakwood, a future where respect and compassion guided every interaction. Turning to LaTanya, Darnell took her hand, squeezing it gently. Thank you for being with me through this, he whispered. She smiled, her eyes shining. I wouldn't be anywhere else, Darnell. Together, we're building something beautiful. And as they walked out of the auditorium, side by side, they both felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet certainty that Oakwood would stand as a beacon of hope, resilience, and justice, one patient, one employee, one moment at a time. As the weeks passed following Stephanie's suspension, a palpable shift took place at Oakwood Medical Center. The hospital's halls, once filled with an unspoken hierarchy, began to feel different, a change that seemed subtle at first but soon became undeniable. Nurses and doctors exchanged quieter, more respectful greetings with patients, and the staff seemed more attuned to one another, their interactions tinged with a new sensitivity. Conversations that had once been sidestepped now came into the open, creating a space for reflection and accountability. Darnell's decision to hold Stephanie accountable for her actions had left ripples throughout the hospital, affecting not only the staff's approach to their work but also their relationships with one another. Meetings were scheduled to discuss unconscious biases, and the staff participated in new training sessions on compassion, respect, and recognizing prejudices. These sessions encouraged staff members to share their experiences openly, to voice grievances and concerns they might have previously kept hidden. For many, it was a difficult but necessary reckoning, a chance to confront the ways prejudice had seeped into their own thinking, sometimes without them realizing it. Meanwhile, Darnell faced his own personal dilemmas. Each day, he grappled with the weight of knowing that this issue had existed in his hospital under his leadership. He couldn't shake the thought that his oversight had allowed people like Stephanie to act unchecked, to dismiss others simply because they felt they had the power to do so. LaTanya supported him through this, reminding him that leadership was not about being infallible but about learning, adapting, and setting things right. One afternoon, as Darnell made his way through the hospital, he was approached by a young nurse named Aisha. She had always been quiet and diligent, rarely speaking unless spoken to, and her cautious approach belied a depth of intelligence and empathy that didn't go unnoticed by those around her. Mr. Whitmore, she called softly, her voice tentative as she stepped into his path. Darnell stopped, offering her an encouraging smile. Aisha, good to see you. What's on your mind? Aisha hesitated, her fingers fidgeting nervously. I wanted to thank you, sir, for what you did with Stephanie. Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if she feared being overheard. It really made a difference. Darnell's brows knitted as he looked at her with a mix of concern and curiosity. Aisha, you don't have to thank me. But it sounds like there's more on your mind. If you're comfortable, I'd like to hear it. She looked around, as if making sure they were alone, then nodded. I've seen things here. Things that I didn't think I could speak up about. There were times when I noticed how some patients were treated differently, or how staff like me were sometimes overlooked. I felt invisible. She paused, her eyes meeting his with a hint of vulnerability. But when you took a stand, it showed me that I'm not alone. That maybe my voice matters too. Darnell's chest tightened, a pang of regret mixing with admiration for her courage. Aisha, I'm sorry that you ever felt that way here. I never wanted anyone to feel invisible or unheard. That's not what Oakwood stands for. She nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I know that now. It's just, sometimes, it's hard to believe it, you know. When people like Stephanie have been here so long, it makes you wonder if anyone's even paying attention. Darnell let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of her words. I understand, Aisha. And I want you to know that from here on out, things will be different. I'm listening, and so is the board. If you ever have concerns, please, don't hesitate to come to me or anyone else in leadership. Your voice is valuable. Aisha offered him a small, grateful smile. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. It means a lot to hear that. She hesitated again before adding, I think people are starting to feel safer now, to trust that things are changing for the better. As she walked away, Darnell felt a profound sense of purpose rekindle within him. The interactions like this one, the small moments of honesty and bravery from his staff, reminded him of why he had taken on the responsibility of Oakwood in the first place. It was a reminder that the work was ongoing, that the commitment to fairness and justice required constant vigilance. Later that week, the hospital prepared for an internal review meeting, an unprecedented forum where staff could voice their thoughts on how Oakwood could continue to improve. Many employees felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness as they gathered in the large conference room, unsure of what to expect but hopeful that their concerns would be taken seriously. Darnell himself felt a cautious optimism. He knew that the meeting would be challenging, that difficult conversations would arise, but he was prepared to face them head-on. The review began with a statement from Darnell, who stood before the assembled staff with a calm yet resolute demeanor. I called this meeting because I believe that Oakwood can only grow stronger when we're honest with each other, he began, his voice carrying across the room. For too long, we've let assumptions and unspoken biases guide our actions. But that ends now. Today, we're here to listen, to learn, and to commit to making Oakwood a place where everyone, staff and patients alike, feels valued and respected. The room was quiet, each person processing his words. After a moment, hands began to raise, and staff members shared their experiences, some recounting moments of discomfort, others speaking about times they felt overlooked or unheard. The stories were raw, at times painful, but they were necessary. Darnell listened carefully, his heart heavy with both the gravity of their experiences and the hope that by acknowledging them, they could begin to heal. Then, a doctor from the back of the room stood up. Dr. Reed was a senior physician, respected and seasoned, known for his clinical expertise but also for his occasionally blunt manner. His voice was steady as he spoke, though there was a glint of unease in his gaze. Darnell, I think I speak for some of us when I say that this change, while necessary, has left people feeling uncertain, Dr. Reed began. We've been following certain practices for a long time, and I'm concerned that we're moving so quickly that we might be losing sight of practical concerns. Stephanie was out of line, yes, but, he hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. There are people who feel this is setting a precedent that may be difficult to manage. Darnell met Dr. Reed's gaze, understanding the challenge behind his words. I appreciate your honesty, Dr. Reed. Change is hard, and it's natural to feel uncertain. But the reality is that we can't afford to let practical concerns override our commitment to fairness and respect. We're not just managing a facility, we're serving people. And that service must be rooted in humanity, not just efficiency. Dr. Reed nodded, his expression thoughtful. You're right. It's just a big shift to process. We've been trained to focus on medical outcomes, to follow strict procedures. And sometimes, those procedures, they don't leave much room for empathy. That's precisely why we're here today, Darnell replied, his tone firm yet compassionate. To reshape those procedures so that empathy and efficiency can coexist. I know it's a challenge, and I know it won't happen overnight. But I'm asking all of you to be patient and to trust that this is worth it. A murmur of agreement ran through the room, and Darnell could see the relief on some faces, the sense of hope on others. This was no longer just an exercise in policy change, it was a collective journey toward a more inclusive, more compassionate Oakwood. As the meeting drew to a close, LaTanya entered the room, her presence instantly calming the atmosphere. She had been a quiet supporter throughout this process, attending meetings, speaking with staff, offering her insight and empathy where needed. Her perspective, as someone who had experienced firsthand the pain of dismissal and bias, was invaluable, and her presence was both a reminder and a reassurance to everyone gathered. "LaTanya," Darnell said, his voice softening as he motioned her forward. "Would you like to say a few words?" She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, stepping up beside him. She looked out at the faces of the staff, each one filled with a mixture of respect and gratitude. "I just want to say, thank you," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you for being here, for being willing to have these conversations, and for committing to make Oakwood the best it can be. This hospital has always meant so much to Darnell and me, not just because it's our livelihood but because it's a place of healing. And healing doesn't just happen in the body, it happens in how we treat each other." She paused, a warmth in her gaze as she looked at the staff. "You are the heartbeat of Oakwood. Each of you brings something unique and valuable to this hospital. And I want you to know that you are seen, that your voices matter. Together, we're building something beautiful. And I believe, with all my heart, that Oakwood's best days are yet to come." Her words were met with a round of applause, the sound filling the room with a shared sense of purpose and solidarity. Darnell glanced at her, his eyes reflecting both pride and admiration as he took her hand in his, a silent affirmation of the journey they had embarked on together. As the staff began to disperse, the atmosphere was lighter, the sense of camaraderie more tangible than ever before. Darnell knew that this was only the beginning, that the road to change would require constant effort and vigilance. But in that moment, surrounded by the people who made Oakwood what it was, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and hope. The lessons from these past weeks had reshaped him, reminded him of the importance of humility and the courage it took to stand up, even when it meant facing uncomfortable truths. Oakwood was now more than a hospital, it was a testament to resilience, a place where people from all walks of life could come together with a shared commitment to healing and respect. Darnell and LaTanya walked out of the conference room, side by side, the weight of their experiences making their strides both purposeful and calm. They had faced the storm, and in doing so, they had forged a future where Oakwood's legacy would endure, rooted in compassion and equality. And as they left, Darnell couldn't help but feel that their journey was not only about setting things right but about creating a place where justice, integrity, and humanity could thrive, now and always. In the months that followed, Oakwood Medical Center transformed in ways few had imagined. Darnell's decision to address the deep-seated biases within the hospital had ignited a profound change that continued to ripple through every corner of the institution. Staff members who once held silent reservations found themselves empowered to speak up, to share their perspectives, and to lean into the culture of compassion that Darnell and LaTanya had fought to uphold. Stephanie's departure left a noticeable void, but it was soon filled by a new generation of nurses who embodied the hospital's renewed commitment to equity and respect. The hospital saw a rise in morale, as the staff began to trust in their leadership and feel seen in ways they hadn't before. Darnell had turned Oakwood into a space where everyone, patient and employee alike, knew they would be treated with dignity. For Darnell, this journey had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Each day, he carried the lessons of the past, using them to fuel his vision for Oakwood. He was no longer just a hospital administrator, he had become a symbol of integrity, a leader who stood by his values no matter the personal or professional cost. He knew that Oakwood's true legacy would be defined by the small moments of respect, compassion, and fairness that now characterized its culture. LaTanya, having endured the painful experience that set all of this in motion, found herself at peace with the outcome. Her quiet strength and grace had always been her anchor, and now she felt a sense of closure. In seeing her husband take a stand, she had witnessed the best of him, a man committed to justice, not just for her but for everyone who entered Oakwood's doors. She continued to visit the hospital regularly, a warm, comforting presence that patients and staff had come to appreciate. For LaTanya, Oakwood was now a place of healing in every sense of the word. The community began to take notice as well. Word spread of Oakwood's transformation, of how it had become a model for other institutions struggling with the same unspoken issues. Patients who had once felt overlooked now shared stories of attentive care, and the hospital's reputation grew, not just for its medical expertise, but for the humanity it displayed at every level. Then, unexpectedly, an anonymous donor contributed a substantial sum to Oakwood's Patient Assistance Fund, allowing patients from all backgrounds to access care without financial barriers. The donation was used to build a new wing, named the Whitmore Pavilion, honoring Darnell and LaTonya's commitment to equality and dignity in healthcare. This new wing served as a reminder to all who entered Oakwood that compassion was the foundation upon which the hospital was built. For Stephanie, however, the aftermath of her suspension was far less favorable. Her actions at Oakwood had reverberated beyond the hospital, affecting her reputation and her professional standing. Hospitals in the region were hesitant to hire her, knowing the story of her dismissal and the values it represented. She found herself reflecting on her past behavior, on the assumptions she had made, and the dignity she had denied to others. Unable to return to her previous career, Stephanie was forced to confront the stark reality of her own choices. She began volunteering at a small community clinic, an opportunity that forced her to serve those she had once overlooked. In time, Stephanie came to understand the value of humility, of seeing people for who they truly were. Her path forward was a humbling one, but it was also her only chance at redemption. Darnell's journey came full circle on the day the Whitmore Pavilion was unveiled. He stood before an assembled crowd of community members, patients, staff, and colleagues, his heart swelling with pride as he looked out at the people who had made Oakwood what it was. LaTonya stood by his side, her hand in his, both of them grounded by the sense of fulfillment that came from knowing they had upheld their values. Addressing the crowd, Darnell spoke from the heart. Oakwood was built on a foundation of healing, and true healing begins when we look beyond the surface, when we recognize each person's inherent worth. This pavilion stands as a symbol of that belief. It is a promise that Oakwood will always be a place where every person is treated with respect, where everyone is valued. The applause that followed was heartfelt, a testament to the journey they had taken together. LaTonya looked up at him, pride in her eyes. Together, they had weathered the storm and emerged stronger, more united than ever. As they left the stage, a nurse approached them with a broad smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for everything. Working here, it's different now. We're proud to be part of Oakwood." Darnell and LaTonya exchanged a look, gratitude shining in their eyes. They had achieved what they'd set out to do, not just for themselves, but for every patient, every staff member, every life touched by Oakwood. They had turned a moment of injustice into a legacy of compassion and strength. This story isn't just about one hospital, one couple, or even one mistake, it's about how we treat each other at our core. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone made an assumption about you? How did it make you feel? And what can we do, in our everyday lives, to create spaces where everyone feels valued and respected? Think about Darnell's journey, his resolve to make things right despite the challenges, and consider what it means to truly lead with integrity. Are there moments in your life where you could stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult? Remember, every action we take can be part of something bigger, a step toward a world where dignity and respect are the default, not the exception. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of respect, compassion, and fairness, please consider subscribing to Tales of Twist. Here, we explore stories that not only entertain but also challenge us to look deeper, to think harder, and to imagine a world where justice always finds its way. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we look forward to sharing more with you.